Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome to Nightlight, everybody. Thanks for sharing your evening with us. We really appreciate it. I want to thank Ken Quiethawk for that amazing introduction. Please check his website out. It's nativestorytellers.com. It's an amazing way of preserving history, far better than our textbooks, I fear. So do check it out. Mark has an incredible show tonight. He has a very special guest. I'm so excited because this is one of my favorite people and one of my absolute favorite topics. I can't wait to hear where they go with it. So I'm going to let Mark get started right away. Here you go, Mark.
Yeah. Hey, Barbara, how are you?
Doing well. Doing well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to remind the listeners that Friday, as well as throughout the weekend, they have the summer solstice events at America's Stonehenge and the Serpent Mound. So I just want to keep everyone just reminded about that. And let's see. Okay, we have a little tech issue there. Okay, we're back. And most of our shows focus on what the guests have observed or tested. You and I have been to several of the places that have been featured on our shows, and we know they exist. We have had guests like Jason Jarrell, who have reviewed a lot of the reputable documentation about giants. We even have photographic evidence in Dr. Don Dragoo's Mounds for the Dead. So we don't need to destroy any more mounds. We know giants were here. But tonight we're going to be dealing with a topic that is less tangible or observable, but is very plausible, and the information is documented. I'm talking about Atlantis, and Gary Wayne is our returning guest. And though his magnificent book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, does focus a lot on the giants, it covers the evolution of societies and how they became corrupted by interactions with giants. Of course, one of the earliest societies is Atlantis. So I better give our guest bio. Gary Wayne is the author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy and founder of the website Genesis 6 Conspiracy. He is deservedly an in-demand radio guest is a self-proclaimed Christian contrarian. Barbara and I are establishment contrarians, so we'll be monitored by some government agency tonight and probably some churches. And that Haley from a couple weeks ago will be getting me into trouble with the mainstream archaeologists. And then there's the Major League Baseball fiasco I found myself embroiled in. But I'm doing it for Richard's Boys. Yeah. I'm doing it for Richard's Boys. But it's worth it. Hopefully by tomorrow it'll be straightened out. It's been a rough week and it's only Tuesday, but that's usually the way things go. But anyhow, hi Gary, how are you?
I am doing just fine, and so happy to rejoin you on your show and with Barbara. And sorry to hear you're having some pushback on some of the things that you discuss and cover. I think that comes with the territory, but sometimes it pours, so to speak. And just make sure you're navigating the waters, and it'll be fine.
I think a lot of people are just in like arc, like we were talking about. There's no rudder. We're just going with the tide. We're just trying to find that little piece of dry land, but we're getting there. But before since we're going to be focusing a lot on Atlantis, it's going back into deep antiquity. We might want to start off with having a better understanding of maybe how the ancients kept track of time. You get these a few examples of aging in the Bible, and it's like Methuselah was nearly 1,000 years old. If you go by the traditional biblical timekeeping, the universe is like 6,000 years old. So did Methuselah live like almost 1/6 of the entire existence of the universe? I've always wondered about that, but you've also argued that there's also kind of like an implied passage of time, very early on in like the first couple passages in Genesis. So maybe we need to understand that concept of time first.
Sure, it's a good place to start. And when people look at what the Bible says, they tend to not look at what the Bible says in a lot of cases. They tend to listen to what many people say it says, which is why I am a contrarian, is because I tend to look at things from a different perspective than what standard dogma may look at things, but I verify things myself. And so when you do that and you actually do your own research and try and verify some of the things that are said, you start to look at some of that dogma and say, well, that doesn't really sound right. It doesn't really match up sort of what the Bible says, because there's be way too many consistencies if one accepted that sort of dogma. So when you're talking about Methuselah and with the accounting of a 6,000-year history, and your comparison is so sort of visual and sort of encapsulates it that he would be like 1/6 of the whole age of the universe. But I'm not convinced that the Bible actually says that the earth is only 6,000 years old. In fact, I would say that what the Bible does tell us is that the lineage back to Adam would be about 6,000 years. But that doesn't mean that the universe or the earth is only 6,000 years old. It's sort of just one of those implied, assumed sort of doctrines. But if you go back to days 4 through 6, you get this really odd verbiage in Genesis 1:27 where it says that male and female created in plural, which is very, very strange, and I'll come back to that in a second, says to replenish the earth. And of course, a lot of people say, well, replenish just means fill the earth. Well, that's one possible translation, but you have two possible translations there. And replenish, even in the time of the translators of the King James Version, meant to refill. And even though you could translate it both ways, it's not sort of a last 100 years sort of understanding. So it's very odd that King James Version translators would choose the word replenish, but other translations of the modern English just say fill the earth. But what you have is a beginning of irreconcilable differences between the creation of day 4 and day 6. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that because I want to get to Genesis 1:1 to 1:2, but I'm just sort of setting the groundwork here. And so that if you have so many differences in terms, in including I'm looking for the right word here, in terms of the layout, in terms of how the step-by-step creation happens, those are completely different than they are in Eden than they are in the days 1 through 6 account. And you have male and female being created plural and told to roam and multiply and cover the earth, but you have Adam being created in single and being planted in Eden as an agrarian, and then sometime later Eve is created, and down the road you have Cain after Adam and Eve are ostracized from Eden, is going to find a wife in Nod, and it's just a place already, which makes no sense, and to build a city. And of course, the question is who and where does the wife come from? And you get into all of these irreconcilable differences. And I just covered a few of them. And again, for people who may want a step-by-step blow on the differences between days 4 through 6 and the Eden account, get a hold of me through my website, and I'll send you that document. And if that's the case, that these are two different creations because I don't believe the Bible contradicts itself, then you have a small gap. We don't know how big it is and how long a day actually might be. Some people believe 1,000 years, but again, that's a bit speculative, using some metaphors later on in the book for 1,000 years, possible, but you would have at least a gap of 1,000 years between days 4 and 6 to the creation of Adam, and then going forward from there. And as you move back with that replenish comment, if you go back to Genesis 1:1 to 1:2, where it says, in the King James Version, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. You have a couple different ways you can translate that. And so the meaning that the translators are using as they take the Old Testament from Hebrew into English or Greek into English for the New Testament is as many, and particularly in Hebrew, the original words have alternate possible meanings. So you have to apply the right meaning for the narrative. And sometimes that isn't always, in my opinion, done correctly. So the first thing is that you have, in the beginning, God created the heaven, and so we have heaven and we have earth completely created. It's pretty straightforward. But then we move into Genesis 1 verse 2, and it says, and the earth was without form and void. And the word and comes in. And that's not a Hebrew word anywhere. there's no Hebrew word there. It's just interjected by the translators to sort of make sense of that first line. But in the first verse where God created the heaven and earth, you do have a Hebrew word there for and, but not where you begin in verse 2 where it says and the earth. And that word is in verse 1 is F, which means an object of a verb, which has no correlation to the English word that they're using to begin it. Now, other translations will use not and, but now. And what they're trying to imply here, I think, is not only to connect Genesis 1:1 to 1:2, but you get an implied time variation. Like there's a time space, and we don't know how big that time space was. And so you move into the next word that is rather problematic or intriguing or interesting, however you want to describe that, and that's the word was. The earth was without form. And that's the Hebrew word haya, which means to exist or to become or to come to pass or to come into being. And again, that's why some of the modern English translations will have an anecdote, will have a footnote above the page that will say that, or it could be translated, the earth became form and void. So now you even have some of the translators putting an anecdote in there, and they're saying there's two ways of translating that. And so one begins to wonder whether or not the standard dogma has this right. And so you have this and that's put in at the beginning that has a pause, and now you have was that can be translated either became or was, and it's either or in it that it came into existence, except that verse 1:1 says the earth was already created. Now the next word that sort of builds on this whole concept and what's going on between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 and how long is that gap is that most people would understand that as the gap theory. I would call it the renewal of the earth theory, because you have Psalms 104:30 that says, thou sendest forth thy spirit, they are created, and thou renewest the face of the earth. And so as you move forward in verse 2, you have the spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, which I think Psalms 104:30 is talking about. And that's when you have a renewal of the face of the earth. So it's suggesting that the earth was created, there's a time space, it became form and became without form and void, and then the Spirit, the Holy Spirit comes along and renews the earth. So now when you get into the word form, this is where it really starts to get interesting for me as being kind of nerdish on trying to understand the different layers that's going on in the Bible, is it says without form, and that's the Hebrew word tuhu. And that defines, that means desolation or desert or worthless or chaos, just as you have in the polytheist religions, this chaos that is calm for creation. So again, I think there's a parallel polytheist account that's similar to what Genesis 1 is talking about, that, and I cover that off in a chapter in my book. But that's a different rabbit hole. So you have now a possibility where the world became a desolation, a desert, worthless, and in chaos. And what's really odd about that is if you roll forward to Isaiah 45:18, it says, God created the earth not in vain, but to be inhabited. And of course, that word vain is also tuhu. So it says when you insert that word, it didn't create the world void, but to be inhabited. And so when we look at that in comparison with Genesis 1:1, when God created the heaven and earth, and it's showing it as void, and Isaiah says he doesn't create anything that is without form and desolate. He creates things to have people live in, and God, in his words and his commands, things just happen. So there's no need to have a dead sort of earth. And then you have the next word, which is void, which is the Hebrew word buhu. And that means empty, ruin, and waste. So now you've got this, and the earth was without form, was desolate, desert, worthless, in chaos and void, empty, ruin, and a waste. And of course, waste sounds and ruin sounds like something happened to it, right? Mm-hmm. So as you look at the two possible translations, I'm good either way, but I'm looking at this as being more of a building case where you have an earth that was destroyed. And so the next question is what caused it? Mm-hmm. And I think this is where the angelic rebellion fits then in days 1 through 6, which is going to continue shortly thereafter. We're just in verses 1 and 1:2 here. So, and then what's going on here is that you have the word "and" that's used in Genesis 1:2, and the earth was without form. You look at that same application in verse 3 and verse 4 and the other verses that follow where there's the word and again, there's no Hebrew word there. It's just a filler by the translations to make sense in English for us in terms of how we speak and read. And that's when, God says something and there became light, right? Okay, so it's a consequence. It happens after. And so if you use that same application where they're using the filler back in the first example, it means something happened after the earth was created and the heavens were created. So I think, again, it's all pointing back to something that happened. So then if that's the case, and we already have one case rolling forward in Isaiah 45 where it suggests a renewal of the earth and this gap of we don't know how long, is there any support in the Bible? And I won't go through all of them, but I'll give just a couple which are kind of super appropriate for understanding the age of the earth and the flood and everything else as we might understand it. Job 8:8 talks about a former age and about that we know nothing and that our days are but a shadow, which is going to be an interesting sort of comparative to what is talked about in Atlantis as we move on a little bit later. So, but former age, and just to interject, there's a lot of speculation out there that Job is an antediluvian book. The standard dating is somewhere from about 1100 to 1500 BC, but the language in Job and its history is questioned by a lot of other people, and they would put that in an antediluvian writing or before the flood that is somehow regained and added into the Bible. I can go either way on that one. But the former age, if it's an antediluvian writing, then it's talking about an age before, and that's why I throw that in. But just so that we understand, let's put in Job 33 as well, where it also talks about a former time of desolation and waste. And that former time seems to be of desolation, seems to be talking about duhu, boohoo. And if we look at former, as we take that back to Hebrew, that's rishon, which means first, beginning, or first time, which again has sort of an antediluvian and Egyptian connotation to it for the first time or before the flood, or Zet Tepi, as they would call it in the Egyptian religion and history and mythology. And then the word time or age goes back to the word dower in both cases, which means age or time. So first time is a significant sort of word that sort of correlates to how old is the history before the flood. And so we have a couple of examples in Job, and where that intermixes in the New Testament, just to give one from each, is you have 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 4 through 6. It's an interesting account where it says, from, talking about from the beginning of creation. That's 2 chapter 3, verses 4 through 6. And from the beginning, you take that back to Greek, that's the first state or the first time. Just as in the beginning in Hebrew, in the first line is Reshith, which is first time or first place, which is the same thing that the former time was talking about and defining. So you have this consistency that runs through the Bible seemingly on this topic. And then it goes on and it says that the world that was overflowed with and then perished. And then that's in verse 6. Well, everybody thinks that's referring to the flood that happens in, beginning in Genesis 6. Well, maybe not so, because this is saying that this world was, in the beginning, it perished. Well, the earth didn't perish in the flood of Noah. It survived, and the survivors survived, and animals survived, and plants started growing after the waters receded. The earth was not destroyed or perished. What it was, if you read Genesis 1:1 to 1:2, as becoming void and formless and possibly destroyed in angelic rebellion, where they used all of these supernatural weapons that would have destroyed the earth, just as we get those accounts coming out of the Hindu religions for the best examples. And I think people might know what I'm talking about without spending too much time on that. So we have a significant amount of scripture that is supporting an idea that we don't know how the world is. And you have one gap that's a possibility between day 6 and day 7. And then you have where between 1:1 and 1:2 is you could have billions of years that are separating the original creation of the earth, then whatever happens with the angelic realm, and then the rebellion, and then a renewal beginning in verse 2 and 3. And so we don't know how big that gap is. So when people automatically assume that the world is 6,000 years old, they're only really saying is, as we know, the lineage from Adam to today is about 6,000 years, and the rest is open to speculation.
Okay, it's what you're saying about this passage of time is very interesting. I don't think most people are really aware of it. It needs to be discussed.
Most people just accept. Yeah, most people just accept what is stated, which is standard sort of dogma. But the dogma isn't always what the Bible says. And I would also point that there's very little prophecy that's taught in churches, and there's very little things about prehistory taught in churches, and there's practically nothing taught about the giants and how they impacted the flood. So, and that's because in seminary schools in the last few hundred years, they basically said, we're not going to talk about that. But all of what I'm talking about now was standard understanding amongst the ancients and the original church fathers and the Jewish people. So you have this consistency of understanding that somehow has changed into a new dogma in the last couple hundred years.
Yeah, I think probably most people are looking at those first few passages as everything was done within 24-hour, like 6 24-hour days, and God took a break on a Sunday, and then everything, the dinosaurs showed up and followed not too long by Adam, and I thought it was just very important for you to lay that out.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, and I'm good either way. The days 4 through 6 with the Eden account, I'm a little more dogmatic on it because I don't believe the Bible isn't. But I can read the first chapter of Genesis as the dogma would say, or I can look at it from what's coming out of Hebrew and say, now how does it fit with what we know about what else the Bible says? And I think it fits a little bit better where the angelic rebellion is, and also where dinosaurs would fit in, and then also what science is telling us about how old dinosaurs are. Because if you have this unlimited sort of gap, and understanding that when I say unlimited, I do understand that even secular science says the world is 14 to 17 billion years old, which isn't that old. When you think about things in sort of a larger sort of perspective and how long it takes to develop things, that's a very, very short time frame, which kind of works against evolution because it becomes mathematically impossible. But now I'm getting down another rabbit hole. But I do think that the dinosaurs fit a little bit better into between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 from what we're learning about science. And then what the other thing is, I would suggest, is that the dinosaurs seem to be what I would call a preferred being of the Watchers, who were the governors of the earth and the ones who rebelled probably before the renewal of the earth and continued with the rebellion and trying to bring humankind down after the creation of the Adamites. And the reason why I say that is because if you look at the Watchers, they are a certain segment of angels that Daniel 4 refers to 3 times. And as you take that back to Hebrew in terms of what their role was, they're not only ministers, but they also bring messages, but messages of governance and authority for kings. So it's a governorship, just as the Watchers out of First Enoch, and I understand that that's not in the canon, but we get an understanding out of there that they're the ones who ruled the many civilizations of the earth before the flood. And what's important about that is that Isaiah 6 talks about a certain class of angels, which are 6-winged angels that are seraphim. I am being male plural and or meaning ones, and the seraph, which is the singular, these are the ones that are working as ministers in the throne before God with the stones of fire, and actually seemingly have some sort of ministerial capabilities, because one of those seraphs takes a stone and touches out of the in front of the altar and touches Isaiah's lips and takes away all of his sins. So it's acting almost in a priest-like role, just as Lucifer had 9 stones, whereas the Levite priests had 12 stones on their vests, which is, to me, again, signifying that there's a priestly aspect to what Satan originally was of Halel, as Isaiah 14:12 translates from Hebrew as. And we also have Satan as being a dragon, and again, these are crossover sort of understandings to what Atlantis brings forth that we'll get into later on, no doubt. And so you have Isaiah 6 as a seraph. If you take that back to Hebrew, the definition comes out as a fiery serpent, fiery 6-winged serpent. And these were the Watchers of Genesis 6. And that if they were these serpent-like looking gods, which we have depictions all over the world, and the kingships reflect beings that had serpent faces to look just like them in the beginning, in the age of man, and they are the offspring of them, they tend to take on that look. And the connection back to dinosaurs is these seraphim seem to have had the dinosaurs ruling the earth in the gap that we're talking about in Genesis 1:1 to 1:2 before they're destroyed, however they're destroyed, whenever they're destroyed. And they are this reptilian type of being. And as we're learning now from science, is many of these, and maybe most of them, weren't just these sort of lizard forms of skins, but they had feathers. And so when you look at a serpent angel with 6 wings, you have a feathered serpent or a feathered dragon, just as Quetzalcoatl and many of the Central and South American gods were the plumed serpent or the seraphim, and the same gods, just as the Nagas have the same look in the subcontinent of India. And you have sort of consistency of the serpentine imagery that goes to the gods, who are the Watchers, and to the first kings and the offspring, who were the Nephilim of Genesis 6. And this is consistent all around the world. And so if they were ruling the world before it was destroyed, they probably created beings after their own image.
Okay. Gary, you're really putting a lot of these, world cultural concepts into perspective for us. So, at what point do we find Atlantis being created? Where is it located? What was the original? What was going on in the original Atlantis? Let's recreate that time period.
It's a good question for sure, and a good point. And just before I move on, if somebody wanted a step-by-step layout of what I talked about with the renewal of the Earth, again, get a hold of me. I've got a good document that I send out to a lot of people, and you just have to ask for it. I'll send it to you. Atlanta, there's two schools of thought on when Atlantis fits in. Atlantis is thought to be a civilization, and one of the civilizations before the flood in the same period as we would have had Noah and Seth and Cain and Tubal-Cain and the descendants of both genealogies coming down from Adam through Cain and Seth. And then the other thought is that it is an older civilization, but also within the polytheist and particularly the theosophic and Gnostic belief is that this older civilization or this parent civilization to the 4, 7, 9, or even more civilizations that were before the flood, and I think it's probably 4 or 7 as opposed to larger numbers, but there's different accounts. So I'm just throwing all of those out. Would be the parent civilization would be Lemuria. So is Lemuria the same as Atlantis, and Atlantis is just a continuation, or is Lemuria the civilization that populates these 4 to other 9 civilizations around the world? Not real sure on that. There's nothing definitive on that. But I think Lemuria, if it did exist, if there was that single parent one, is different than Atlantis. And so I personally, with my research, I look at Atlantis as being the time of Noah, back to the time of Jared and Noah, because in Enoch First Enoch, we have the giants being created in the generation of Jared. The Bible says in the time and the days of Noah. That's not a contradiction because Noah lived during the same period that Jared did because of the crossover of their long lives. It's pretty easy to have a several 100-year crossover if you examine the chronology and the genealogies. And so I would place Atlantis back then. And the reason why I would place Atlantis then is I compare the Atlantean account to the Genesis 6 account. And Genesis 6, and noting that Genesis 6 is the preamble to the flood. So Genesis 6, 1 through 4, then you get Noah's commission and his account, and then you get the flood story. So the giants, or the Nephilim as giant, goes back to Hebrew. Nephil, I am male plural again, are seemingly interconnected as the cause of the flood. I think there's violence and things going on before, but they're the key accelerator that is going to bring on the flood. And it's no coincidence that they would be right at the preamble to the start of the flood story, which continues through, chapter 7 and into chapter 8 to a certain degree. Now, in Genesis 6, you have the sons of God, who have already talked about as being the watchers, and the seraphim angels, and the same watchers as Daniel 4, going to human females and producing giants, which are Nephilim, as their offspring, and they were the mighty ones and the men of renown of the earth. And, of course, everybody knows mighty ones, which is Gibborim. Gibor, I am male plural again. AH would be the female plural, Gibborah, or Gubara, to be more accurate. And so you have these beings that are known as the mighty ones and the men of renown. And renown goes back to the word which means fame, and jointly to Shem, which is, again, the I am is the plural, which means heavenly or heavenly ones. And you get that word Shemayim, which is used in Genesis 1:1 in the word God created heaven. So these are the ones who are from heaven, or the offsprings of the one from heaven. And so these are the demigods of the ancient world. And demigod, as you define that, and or the heroes out of ancient Greece, and we're talking about Atlantis, so using the same analogous terms here. Hero was a demigod and a giant, and defined as the offspring of a human female and the gods. And that's why in some of the English translations you won't see mighty ones, but let's say in some of the modern English ones, it would use the heroes of old. So again, the same term that is going to be used for the offspring of the second-tiered gods of Olympus, like Zeus, for example, or Zeus, as some people pronounce it, and human females. Now, what's interesting about all of that, of course, they produced from Zeus, he would have produced like Hercules and Theseus and Perseus and famous heroes like that. Poseidon, who is also, I think, Iapetus in Greek mythology, because the different variations of the stories tell a different story, even though you can look at some of the genealogical charts and it has Iapetus as coming from, different gods. But that's not as being created from different gods, but that's not unusual in any of the other pantheons around the world, like in Egypt, where you've got several accountings and they don't always mesh up, right? Because they're using different cities and kind of like, even though they're part of the overall same civilization, those were city-states that operated independently of each other, and they tended to write maybe not exactly the same versions. And so Poseidon or Iapetus goes to a human female, Clymene or Clyto, again, depending on whether or not which version you're reading, and they produce 10 Titan, and Titan can mean a god or a hero, and a Titan generally is the lower gods, so not the parent gods. 10 Titan kings, and this includes Atlas of Atlantis. And so you have not just one island civilization, but you have 10 parts to this empire that would include North Africa, parts of Europe, let's say into Portugal and Spain, into Central and South America, into Ireland, into England, and composing 10. I detail all of that in my book, but just to give people an idea that this is a very, very large antediluvian civilization. And when I say antediluvian, I mean before the flood. And so you have the same story being told in the Atlantis creation of the civilization, with a god or a fallen angel going to a human female, creating the giants or the Nephilim, and they become the demigods and the kings of the antediluvian world, and they rule over humankind. So all of that suggests that Genesis and the Atlantean and Greek accounts are talking about the same parallel story, one from a monotheist lens, one from a polytheist lens, and the time frame would be similar from that sort of accounting and connecting the dots. What's interesting, though, is in the Atlantis account that Plato writes, and there are other accounts, but he writes the two most famous ones, and they are Critias and Timaeus. And Plato recounts Solon, who is, sort of a few generations before Plato, because Plato lived in about 427 to 347 BC. But Solon, he's going to write about Solon's meeting with the Egyptian priests, and where he reads off of the columns in Say's Egypt of the Atlantean. And what is interesting, which goes back to this sort of gap theory in these two different types of flood things that are going on that Second Peter talks about, in chapter 3, verses 4 through 6, is that the Egyptians tell Solon that, you remember one deluge, but there have been many catastrophes and floods, and their catastrophes would include water and fire, and they kind of alternate. And so when you had 2012, for example, with celestial precession and that clock that keeps counting, and we started into this new age, and one of those ages is 2,360 years. That's the age of Aquarius, as people understand it in the New Age movement, is that begins this new age of over 2,000 years where the world is going to be destroyed on this with fire, which is, again, very, very similar to what the end times prophecies around the world, including the Bible, will talk about, but it doesn't say when. So it wasn't going to happen immediately in 2012. And, by using that size of time count, it could take 1,000 years or almost 2,000 years, right? So we don't know when that's going to happen. But they talk about more than one deluge, which is now sort of brings back that thought, is Atlantis older than what is being talked about in how I compare Genesis 6 with the Atlantis story? Or is that parent civilization that the Theosophists like to call Lemuria? So sort of an interesting an accounting coming out of Plato's account. And again, if anybody wants the true accounts and the most details of Atlantis, read Timaeus or Critias. But I always sort of look to Plato as the true source that sort of gives more details, which are more relevant to connecting dots around the world. And what's interesting about the Plato account is he's taking this as history, and then people that follow him, including his the students that he mentored and later historians, they will now cite Plato's account not as legend, but as history. And so in the ancient world, this was understood as an actual fact, as is the flood considered an actual fact. And as Josephus will talk about the flood and all of these ancient historians that documented it as fact. So we have to be careful with, I would almost say, propaganda that we get out of science today, of how they readily dismiss everything in the past and come up with theories that I'm not so sure stand the test of time or the scrutiny. But again, I'm going down another rabbit hole. But so that's how I arrive at what Atlantis is and how old it is.
Yeah, and Gary, just you can take a break for a second, get a catch your breath, or have a drink of water. But listeners, if you like what the information that Gary's been presenting, you can go to his website, Genesis 6, the number 6, conspiracy.com, and his book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, really is it's really well documented, researched, just fascinating read. Was compressing thousands of years of all these societies and how they have been affected by giants and a lot of the philosophies that came from these very early cultures, and how they impact, or how they're impacting us even today with you do cover Nazis and some of the really bad theories that are, or philosophies that are out there. So I really enjoy this book. I can't recommend it enough. It's terrific, and Gary, you've been making so many distinctions with all these, helping us to understand where you're getting this information. And an interesting point that you do bring up is like the Book of Enoch is more specific about Atlantis, but the traditional biblical canon really doesn't mention it. But you argue for that in the book of Isaiah that there is a reference to Atlantis, with it's an antediluvian depiction of Atlantis. Can you tell us about that distinction between Isaiah and some of the Apocrypha books? And you've also given us like Job and some of the Noah information as well.
Yeah, and I think that you can get a larger understanding of the flood account and Atlantis account by reading Enoch, and then again, I like to verify everything through what's written in the Bible. And so typically the flood is just waters coming up from the earth and rain coming down from the sky. But as you get into other chapters in Psalms, and I have a full chapter of this in my book, is there are more descriptions of the earth being turned over and drained and upheaval that's going on, that it relates more to the Enoch description of a flood that is a conflagration of catastrophes that was part of it. And I'll cover all of that off. So, and people are just looking for evidence of a flood as a straight flood, but if you understand that, as it's also told in all the other accounts around the world of the flood, it's more than just a flood. Yes, there's the flood, but there's volcanoes and earthquakes and continents going up and continents going under the sea, and it starts to answer all of these questions about why you have all of these underwater cities that are of an age that just don't line up with secular science. But the verse I'm referring to where I think it actually talks about Atlantis is Isaiah 23.
Right.
And it's talking about Tyre, the city of Tyre and its destruction. But this is one of those, what I call dual prophecies in the Bible. And it has a couple of markers to know when we're having a dual prophecy. So one, it has an understanding that connects back to prehistory so that we understand what's going on in prehistory. The second one is it has a prophecy that is going to be fulfilled in the not so distant future. And in this case, the destruction of Tyre, which comes at the hands of the king of Babylon in Babylon's and Nebuchadnezzar's romp to overthrow all the civilizations of the known world of that time and to consolidate it all under one empire. And then you have a connection to the end time. And so I think Isaiah 23 is one of those dual prophecies. And the classic example of one of those dual prophecies that has prophetic allegory in it, and that's the other marker or concept that I'll define in a minute, would be Isaiah 14, which actually begins in Isaiah 13. And another one would be Ezekiel 28 and Ezekiel 32. And I'm just starting to put out a 3-part series on Facebook on Ezekiel 32 to explain that. And the prophetic allegory part comes in is in some of the details that you get in this prophecy that's going to happen on the shore, it doesn't always match up. And again, I don't believe that the Bible is in contradiction. So when I look at it as a greater understanding, as in, let's say, Isaiah 14, where you have clearly a description of Lucifer, that comes out of Hebrew as Halel, and I prefer to call Halel or Satan, about his fall from grace and his rebellion in the ancient world. You also have Hel-El, which is H-E-L-E-L, which is an allegory deriving off of Halel, H-E-Y-L-E-L, for Satan, which I think was his original name, particularly because it ends in E-L, as most all angelic names are, like Michael or Gabriel or Azazel, and you can name them all. I think the ones that aren't might have, right? Just one of those sort of standards.
That makes sense.
You know, Uriel, Raphael, go on and on and on, right? Ariel. And so I think this is his original name. But so you have also in there Hel-El, or the king of Babylon, and it's going to talk about his fall, and also the Assyrian, which is another Antichrist reference to the end time. But within this, it's talking about a man. So a lot of people will look at Isaiah 14 and say, well, there's more than one Satan, and or Satan is a Nephilim and or a man. It's talking about two different individuals. It's talking about an allegorical aspect to the end time of this king of Babylon and Assyrian, and to the future king of Babylon, who's going to be actually Nebuchadnezzar, who's going to destroy Tyre in this case. And you also have Halel in Isaiah 14:12 as the original rebellion. And all of these Rephaim kings are doing is setting up and doing the organizational structure of the Watchers and continuing in the rebellion. And so I know that's a whole mouthful in terms of it, but I just want to give people an idea what I'm talking about when I say a dual prophecy, so that when we look at some of these terms that are being talked about in the destruction of Tyre, it says, "Be silent, you people of the island, and you merchants of Sidon," which is Tyre. And so it's talking about an island. And so Tyre isn't technically an island. It's kind of a land-based thing that has a bridge attached to it, but it's not this typical island that you would have out in the middle of the sea, right? It's basically right along shore, very well protected, and thought was impenetrable until Nebuchadnezzar comes along and takes care of that. And so this is the city of revelry, the old city. And anytime in the Bible you have old, or times of old, or former age, as I was alluding to early on in the show, and there's other terms, these are all antediluvian terms, or into a former age, which could be another age in behind. And typically the age before the flood is one age, and the age after the flood, the post-diluvian age, is another epoch or age as the Bible lays it out. So Tyre wasn't there before, but it's being talked about as it is. So I think Tyre is an allegory for Atlantis. And it's the bestower of crowns, whose merchants are princes and traders renowned on the earth. That term, renowned, that's the same term that is being used for the men of renown, right? Of heaven, Shem and Shemaim. And you have the bestower of crowns. Well, the bestower of crowns is in the Greek mythology where all of these ancient kings are awarded their kingship, just as they are awarded kingship in the Sumerian, which would be an identical type of pantheon, just in a different civilization at the same time, where you have at Nippur the kings being awarded their kingship as part of the Ring of Kings, or the Lord of the Rings, as Tolkien will write about that in his famous trilogy, who are going to rule the earth. So again, we have these antediluvian terms that are thrown in, and it doesn't mean that Tyre didn't set up, let's say, transplanted or branch kingdoms for their trade and had rulers ruling over over there, like the Libyans, for example, would have been one of those areas. But the meaning to the words are more to what happened in the end time, in prehistory, so you have an understanding what's going on, just as this is going to happen in the end time with these 10 kings being set up who are going to be traitors of the Babylon empire that Antichrist is going to take over at the midpoint of the last 7 years, and they're going to go, grow rich through Babylon. So again, I'm just throwing out a few examples of where this is now also talking about details that it's going to be about the city of Rome in the end time. And then it says, the Lord Almighty planned it to bring low the pride of all the glory and to humble all who are renowned on the earth. So again, that's talking with antediluvian terms with the pride, because the giants for the flood, they grew evil and they actually rebelled against the gods and were trying to enslave and destroy humankind, which is part of that overall plan that they have, so that humans are not going to be raised above the angelic realm in the future time. And so they overreached, which is where the word hubris comes from, which goes back to what happened with these heroes at the time of the flood and their overreach. And so this is the pride, and sin is pride, and they became sinful and they rebelled against God. So again, all of the imagery in the language is talking about prehistory for understanding, and they're doing the same thing after the flood with the Rephaim kingships and the empire. So Nebuchadnezzar is the first start of the famous 4 that are going to be talked about in prophecy. That's going to have Babylon first, Persia, Mede second, Greece third, Rome, and then for the end time, the revived Roman Empire, which Antichrist is going to come along. And then before that, you had Assyria and Egypt, all kings beforehand. And so again, to understand what's going on in prehistory and in prophecy, you need to understand the players in the Bible and define things within the Bible so that you can understand what they're talking about. And so, it says God has made all of the the kingdoms tremble. Mm-hmm. And so this island is destroyed by God and the storms and what happens, the conflagration of catastrophes. But Nebuchadnezzar doesn't destroy it that way. He actually invades it, tears it down, and burns it. So again, the details don't line up. So it's either the Bible is either in contradiction, or it's talking about that dual prophecy aspect. And of course, when you look at Babylon in the end time, which is another dual prophecy in Jeremiah 50 and 51, you have this destroyer who is connected to Antichrist, and I won't go down that rabbit hole right now. That gets back to Abaddon, Apollyon, and Azazel. But also understand Antichrist is the one who destroys Babylon in Revelation 17 at about the midpoint of the last 7 years.
Yeah, Gary, what the passage from Isaiah 23 that you read and dissected for us. There's that island right there at the beginning of the passage in chapter 17. I missed that the first time I read the book of Isaiah. It's just like little things like that where you're close reading, and then convincing arguments you make for the case that the Bible is talking about Atlantis, since it does clearly mention island, and Tyre was I think it says a landlocked country, so it can't be both. So it was
can't be both.
You're
so
making
there's an allegory going on there, right?
just want to give you an example of how your writings really put into perspective, the antediluvian world, and even go into the like the Zeptepi, discussing Ethiopia. I mean, that really doesn't come up in the Bible all that much, but the African countries did play a role in the a post-Diluvian world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it was an important, it was a very important role too.
Yeah.
But where does that? You draw our attention to that cult of bulls. You mentioned like there was a little bit of a rebellion getting started, and the cult of bulls was another one of those ceremonial practices that kind of started pushing Atlantis from the more advanced culture to some where we're starting to descend into chaos. What do we have going on there with the cult of bulls?
Sure. And let me just connect some of the dots on what you were just talking about, and then we'll talk about the bull cult.
Yeah, please do, because I have a
tendency
to
ramble.
I
love what you brought up about. That's okay. I love to go all over the place too, so we make a good pair that way.
Yes.
So you're talking about Ethiopia and Antiochus, and if people remembered what I said earlier, part of the Atlantean Empire was in North Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And what's important about that is that Ethiopia, as where it is, wasn't located where it was today. It was in North Africa, right? And the old spelling of it was Antiochus. And so this was part of the Atlantean Empire. And again, this is coming out of the Greek recollection of history, so that you start to connect, more of the dots. And Berosus, who had access to the temple tablets of history before the flood, is the one who wrote Babylonica for the Greeks in the time of Alexander, so that history wouldn't be lost. But a lot of his works were lost anyways by Berosus. But Berosus looked at Babylon as the city of the end time that I referred to, that will ultimately see it take shape as allegorically. But Berosus looked at Babylon as being the first city of Babylon isn't created till after the flood, right? Either at Babel, as we understand it in Genesis, although the location probably isn't where Babylon was. That's more down by Eridu, as the Enmerkar example of Sumerian history talks about the same Babel event takes place. But where I'm going with this is that he said Babylon was the first city of cities, an antediluvian city, which was Atlantis. And so as I connected Atlantis in the previous rant in terms of Tyre, Atlantis, Babylon, and Babylon of the end time, you have, again, this secular history written by Berosus that connects perfectly through with what the Bible is talking about. And so I just wanted to let everybody know that in the book, I'll not only talk about what the Bible says, is I'll bring in sources from historians, from secret societies, from different legends, different religions, and I'll let them all tell their own story and then show you how that compares to what it says in the Bible. So I don't want to manipulate the words. I like to let them speak for themselves, because things sort of blend very well if you just sort of let things read, and particularly if you just let the Bible read, it will tell its own story for you if you let it. And so when we talk about the bull cult. I mean, this sort of has to do with that astrology aspect and when the zodiac is invented, and that's all antediluvian. And in two different accounts, you get where the zodiac is created. There's an Enochian account that he's the one who creates the zodiac and creates sun and creates the bull cult and develops the seven sciences that he learns from his father Cain, who learned it from his father Adam, who learned it from God while in Eden. And he develops it in the seven sacred sciences that are going to mesh with the additional illicit knowledge that the fallen angels are going to provide him and humankind to accelerate it to a level that's going to bring the world to its knees and bring on the flood. And so from a non-biblical source, if we're looking at in terms of how that sort of transpires, is you now have Atlantis as the source of creating this and astrology and creating this technology. And, according to Plato, they were, the greatest engineers and architects and would have built all of these great megalithic structures that are around the world, including the pyramids, including Stonehenge. And
right.
Of course, Egypt was part of the empire, part of Zep Tepi the first time. So just again connecting some more dots, and or the biblical and or Enochian understanding is Enoch was part of that. What is most likely is that the polytheist tradition adopts Enoch as the one bringing of this knowledge, and he's raised to like a Mercury type level as bringing knowledge to humans. And I'm not going to go too far into that one because we want to get to the bull cult, which was the question. And so the Taurus is part of the zodiac, which comes out of this bull cult, sun worshiping a mix of religion that Enoch creates and is also utilized by Atlantis and all the ancient civilizations. You have this bull cult that goes all around the world, whether or not it's the Calf or the Apis bull cult in Egypt, the bull cult in Atlantis, which it's very, very famous for. You have the bull cult of Canaan, and it comes from the age of Taurus, that 2,360-year period that we talked about. So it can stretch both before and after the flood.
Okay.
And what's interesting about that is that you have that same sort of consistency to what's going on in the ancient world. And also understand that the Minotaur, which is part of Greek mythology as well, and the labyrinth, which is a big part of the mystical and polytheist religions, he was a bull that was presented to King Minos, and then Minos is, he crosses the gods, and you have the creation of this Minotaur, which is, a bull's head in this human form, and they have to sacrifice people and young people and babies to feed this Minotaur in the labyrinth. So again, I think it's just again telling another story about the bull cult from a Greek side of it. But this bull cult is the religion that we know of that is also the sun worshiping religion, and it goes back to both Atlantis and or Enoch.
Wow. Okay. So, Gary, what happened with how does the bull cult take us to the corruption that we're going to continue to experience throughout history,
right,
like with Merovingians or some of the King Arthur, the people that you cover, or some people, some of the cultures you cover later, the House of Stuart and.
So the organizational structure, which is very, very important to understand in prehistory and the world that we have today, it includes the kings and the nobility who come from the original kings, which is the ruling class, and the religion that they impose, and within the polytheist pantheons around the world, and they're all the same pantheon, just different vernacular names for the same gods.
Okay.
All with the same root that goes back before. And so this is that sort of bull cult and the organizational structure that crosses the flood and becomes part of the Rephaim kingships, which is, again, Rephaim, if people aren't familiar with that term, I should have explained it a little bit earlier in the show when I brought it out. The word only goes back to Nephilim 3 times in the Bible. That's in Genesis 6, where they're created, and in Numbers 13:33 in the bad report, where it seems like there's an embellishment that these are the descendants of giants. Giants is Nephilim, that the Anakim are their descendants. It's not that the Anakim aren't giants, it's just that it's an embellishment to take it back to the Nephilim before the flood in terms of how I would view that phrase. All the other times where it has giant in the Old Testament, it goes back to Rephaim. So Rephaim are the giants after the flood, Nephilim are the giants before the flood, and it denotes something significant and distinct from them. And I think it's got a lot to do with Genesis 6:3, where their life is limited, as opposed to they had, they were basically a god in a body, physical body, and that would live on forever. And God stepped in and said, no, that's not going to happen. The body's not going to live forever. And so that's why over time, life goes back to a limit of 120 years. So this is that religion that is going to be part of all of the kingships and the dynasties and the bloodlines as they come down through history, in that organizational structure where you have this feudal class with all of the nobility being the bloodlines of the Rephaim after the flood and the Nephilim before the flood, and all the Adamites are the poor and the ignorant and are to be there for slaves and to be abused, to use the sacrifices, to do whatever they want with, because they're inferior, because they don't have the bloodlines that go back to the gods. And so you'll see the bull cult imagery come down, just as you will with the serpentine imagery and the lion imagery, and the unicorn imagery come down with these bloodlines throughout history, and will always be part of the ruling class, because it denotes taciturn understanding of their history and their genealogies. And so a classic example of that, rolling forward, and then I'll work it back, is I mentioned the Minotaur a few minutes ago, and with the Merovingians, who believe they have the bloodlines that go back to the Nephilim or the Rephaim or both, because we don't know exactly how giants show up after the flood. They either survive or they're recreated. So their belief system is that they would have probably survived, and they would take their bloodlines right back to the original Nephilim before the flood. And so they have their legend or their history cloaked in an allegory where their bloodline comes back from a human female mating with a Quinotaur. And a Quinotaur is this bull being that is very, very similar to the Minotaur. And I think this is some sort of, just an allegory that goes back with Nephilim bloodlines. And if we look at what is going on in the bull cult of Canaan out of the Bible, that is the bull cult of El, who is the parent god, like Anu is of Sumeria, and Kronos would be one of the parent gods of Greece, and Ra or Ptah would be one of the parent gods of Egypt, just to show the consistency in terms of that pantheon that I was talking about. He's the typical bull cult that produces Baal and Moloch, which is all about the bull cult that Israel is going to be up against with the Rephaim, that they are going to be at war with, as they are trying to take the covenant land from the Rephaim, who laid it in wait to try and destroy Israel from the face of the earth. So these just weren't nations. These were Rephaim nations and Rephaim hybrid giants with high technical weapons against this nation of slaves that didn't have factories or anything else and went up and defeated these giants, which could only be done through the power of God. Otherwise, they would have had no chance. And so this is the imagery and the bloodlines that all of the royal family take their genealogies back to, is these Rephaim kingships that's developed after the flood. So when I talk about the Rephaim kingships, I did the major ones where I talked about Egypt with the pharaohs and Assyria, which comes after that, and Babylon and Persia, and all the way down through Greece and Rome and the end time empire will all be the bloodline and the extension of the metallic empires talked about in Daniel 2 and the animal empires of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. And I think there's a dual prophecy there as well, with Daniel 8 also reflecting the 7 that are talked about in Revelation 17. So anyways, you have Egypt and Babel as being the two main pillars of civilization and religion and empires after Babel, after the dispersion. And so Nimrod is going to continue developing the 7 sacred sciences and the religion that Hermes had previously brought back to him. This is now I'm using Gnostic and secret society history that Hermes discovered the 2 pillars of Enoch or Lamech. There's a few different legends on that, and discovers the knowledge of the ancients, Enoch, Atlantis, Emerald Tablet, Golden Fleece, all these different terms refers to the same bank of knowledge that's hidden on pyramids in 9 vaults stacked on top of each other, which had 36,525 books of knowledge of the ancient world and also of the religion. He takes that back to Nimrod at Babel, and they use that knowledge to build Babel City and Babel Tower, and are recreating the rebellion that took place after the flood within 100 years that took place before the flood, and are rebelling against God again, and God disperses the language. And what's interesting about all of that is in Akkadian, the word Babel, Babe-El, E-L, remember I said is angel or God, that you take that back to Hebrew. In Akkadian, Bab is gate, and El means the same thing. It could be spelled I-L or I-L-U or A-L. It's just transliterations in different languages of the same word. That is now, Bab is gateway or portal of the gods. And people think that they were trying to build a portal to get the imprisoned angels out of the abyss out of Revelation 9. But I digress. Back on topic. So the first 2 dynasties are in Shinar, which is Sumer, because that's where Babel was built, and in Egypt, where Hermes goes with Mizraim and develops the Egyptian society and where the pyramids are, because again they're honoring and starting out from the ancient facilities and monuments to their gods of their pantheon that they've now implemented after the flood. They're going to go back to those holy places to create these civilizations and societies. And you also have, after the flood, these Aryans and or Scythians that are coming down from the Scythia region, where it is believed in legend and in other civilizations' accounts, and particularly Greek in this case, that these are the heroes, the giants that are somehow escaped the abyss that they are imprisoned with after the flood to repopulate the earth. So that's one of the stories on how they might survive. And they're known as the Mitanni, which are the Aryan or the Meria Anu. And Anu is like Tuatha Danann or Danu, that these are the tribes of Anu. And of course, Anu is the father of the Anunnaki in the Sumerian tradition. And of course, the Tuatha Danann, they're going to migrate up to Sweden and Norway and into Russia and into Romania and into Ireland and into England and be the blonde-haired and blue-eyed Aryans that the Nazis take themselves back to, and the red-haired hazel-eyed ones that the fairy people in allegory, there's another rabbit hole I won't go down today, take their imagery back to. And so what's interesting about the red hair and the hazel eyes, these are the same hair colors that we find in skeletons that were discovered in North America and then more recently in Peru. And they all go back to Scythia. So you have this sort of epicenter of giants spanning north and south and into the Middle East with the Mitanni and the Kassites, and they're going to produce the original purebred dynasties that are going to intermarry with Nimrod and then with Mizraim to create these hybrid dynasties, and they will continue to intermarry with these purebred dynasties to ennoble their bloodlines, because within the culture and cult of this world of nobility, the purer your bloodlines and your genealogies, the higher you fit in the hierarchy. So they are always trying to continue to improve their genealogies and keep them as pure as possible. And these are the royal families that will spread their dynasties around the world with a pure form of the most pure-blooded female that they could, because they start new dynasties with matriarchy, which is the fairy allegory, and the dragon side is the patriarchy side. So if you're following their allegory, fairy and dragon is very, very important in understanding. And conversely, owl is the same as fairy, and raven is the same thing as dragon. And of course, that all fits with the understanding of what these watchers were looking like. Serpent-like ones, falcon or raven, or bird-like ones as in Anunnaki or in Horus. And there's a few other ones as well, but the serpent ones are the most common. And so these are the kingships that spread around the world and that intermarries that we see that happen right through history. It continues to happen to this day, and they track their genealogies just as the Merovingians did. And so you have most of the Western royal bloodlines that are taking their bloodlines back to the Merovingians wherever they can, because they were thought to be the most ennobled bloodline of that time. I know I covered a lot of history there in sort of a sweeping fashion, but
okay. I have a question. The subtitle of the Genesis 6 conspiracy is How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. Okay, the last couple shows we did, we had Scott Walter, who recently became a Freemason, and on the episode, hopefully people are listening to our show and will watch the premiere of his Jack the Ripper episode on the replay later tonight after we're off the air. But one of the opening scenes, and it was either tonight or last week's show, it was recreation of an initiation, and Scott even discussed it with the presentation of the skull that is shown to the initiate, and Scott said, well, it's supposed to symbolize, to be humble, and reminds you of your mortality and to make the most of your life. Okay, so this is it's kind of like a creepy ceremony, but it has a good message. It's being the initiative was shown, reminded to be humble. Okay, that is a recreation of Jesus going into Jerusalem on the donkey. Where's the the secret society, becoming, doing something evil with something like that, and we do actually have a question after my rant there, so maybe we can actually take the question. Okay. Okay. There's Joe. Joe, you want to step in here and ask Gary a question?
Yeah, sure do. I came across your radio show right now, the corruption of Atlantis, and that was kind of disappointing to me because as a kid, I've always had an image of Atlantis as being uncorruptible. I've always had a vision of Atlantis either being a great city above the water, or it was a great city enclosed in a bubble below the surface of the water, and it was technologically advanced. But they were advanced because not because they were more intelligent than the normal human, but because they didn't have a lot of psychological problems. Their egos were in check, and as a result, they could see the forest for the trees, and they could advance themselves. So I wanted to find out how, from this particular guest, if he could sum it up, how was Atlantis corrupted?
Yeah, it's a very, very, very good question. And again, that's one of the reasons why I like to get my information directly from the best source.
I got to interrupt here. There's a big echo, so somebody has the show running on in the background, and we're getting an echo because there's a 6-second delay.
Phone. It's my phone. I wish I could do something about it. I'll see what I can do in about 2 seconds. Let's see if this works.
It's better now.
Is it better now?
What you had before you said 2 seconds.
Oh, okay. Let's see if I can fix this now. How's this?
The echo seems gone.
Oh, okay.
No, it's there
No,
still.
it's still there.
Well, that's about the best I can do. So what I'll do, if you just the answer, maybe. Oh no, you can't fix the echo that way. All right. Put me on mute, and that should take care of it. And then you can give me the answer.
Okay.
He's on mute.
There we go.
He's on mute.
Okay. Gary, fire away.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a very, very good question because, that's how Atlantis starts out. And that's how Plato says it starts off, that they had this air of goodness and they looked after the inferior, mundane humankind. And everything they did was good. But because the kings were offspring of gods and humans, is that they have this human component. And over time, the human component starts to infect the godly component, which makes them become evil, and they start to backslide into debauchery and violence and wars and slaughter and all sorts of horrific things that will bring them to the point of rebellion and to the point where the gods have to bring on the flood because they're just the last cause of evil. And although they had this great technology and knowledge, they didn't continue to use it in what is known as the white arts, but in the black magic. Not the white magic, but the black magic. I look at it as the same, but within polytheism, they look at, and you'll know it as a white witch or a dark witch or and on and on and on. They have this sort of dualist sort of understanding of the application of that knowledge. And so that's how they backslide into from where they came from, is how Plato describes it. And I think that's just because of their pride just sort of overtakes, which is what we were talking about earlier in the show. Now, Mark was talking about an initiation ceremony that's quite low level as people are being initiated into the lower levels of secret societies. So understand that these secret societies come out of this knowledge from Enoch in the antediluvian epoch. Enoch, son of Cain, not Enoch, son of Jared. There are two Enochs. And so they are going to develop secret societies to develop the knowledge. And they're going to develop the mystical religion to keep things in secret. So they're kind of the same, sort of different arms of the same branch that Enoch is developing. And so Freemasonry and all of their associated groups, so they may sort of umbrella name, take their history all back to the same source before. Now, as we understand the infrastructure of the modern Freemasonic organization is you have a York Rite and a Scottish Rite. And York Rite is the ancient organizational structure which has the three levels to adepthood. And you learn that and you sort of climb the ziggurat or the pyramid of knowledge and initiations to become a third degree adept. The more common one that's understood in North America is the Scottish Rite, which comes in about the middle 1800s, where those three are split into 33 degrees. Now, in the initial ceremonies that you're being initiated to in Freemasonry, there's only couple of qualifications that you need. One is you need to be invited to join. And typically they're going to invite people based on genealogies. They may be very diluted genealogies, but typically it's all on where some of your ancestors, Freemasons before, and what are their bloodlines. And new money, because they're going to be introducing new talent as well. And at the lower levels, this is a business-orientated networking organization. They do charities, they do good things, and even Shriners have hospitals. So there's a lot of good that they use sort of out front in terms of the cloak, but with the curtain, as in the Wizard of Oz, but it's that wizard behind the curtain. And understand, wizard is a polytheist term for a priest in the religion. It's just an allegory, right? So whether or not it's Merlin or it's the Magi or it's the wizards in Lord of the Rings, they're talking about the priests of polytheism. Now, until you become an adept at the third degree York Rite or the Scottish Rite, is you are considered mundane and inferior and not enlightened. And you are illuminated into the real mysteries at the adept level. So they are preparing you and brainwashing you as you're climbing the ziggurat, but you're still not considered worthy to be told the true secrets. So all of the allegories, all of the symbolisms, all of the narratives that they're teaching you at the lower level are not accurate. They may be at some superficial level, but there's way deeper levels, and you only learn that at the adept level when you're now considered worthy to know the secrets and to participate in what they really want to do and what's really going on in terms of what they're planning and organizing and trying to do in terms of bringing on the end time, because they want world government, they want the universal religion, and they want to bring on a rendezvous with the God of the Bible so that they can win their freedom and live in their own realm, just as what we talked about in Isaiah 14:12, where Lucifer wants to be like God, living in his own realm. That's what they're fighting for, because they know they can't defeat the omnipotent God in the world, even though they deceive their followers that they can. It's the only way they're going to get them to follow them. But the angels that can't win, they always knew they couldn't win. They were trying to just win a realm to live separately from God. Now, people entering in at the lower levels, they're not going to see anything that is going on at the adept level and higher. And understand that in using that old system, the third degree is an adept, that if you're going to oversee different lodges, you're going to be probably fifth degree. And there are higher degrees yet. So I've heard of 9 degrees. I'm not a Freemason. I'm not part of a secret society, so I have to gain my information through research. And I also have heard there's even higher degrees. People who are purebloods are initiated from childhood, and they are adepts by the time they're basically 18 to 20 years old. They may be called a 32nd degree adept, but that's only because they're too young to receive the adept title, even though they have all of the qualifications and maybe even a higher third degree at that point in time. So you have to understand part of the language. But the point of the matter is at the lower levels, it seems like a great organization. Behind the curtains are the wizards. And these are the same people that use an analogy and to sort of bring about the terms is that they are also the Rosicrucians. They are the Illuminati, because the Illuminati are the illuminated level. The Rosicrucians is the crossroads organization to the purebloods above them. So the top half of the Rosicrucians are purebloods. The lower half are lower bloodlines and newer initiatives that show talent, and they'll answer up to the Council of the Committee of 300, which goes up to the Council of 33, which goes to the 13 families. And what's important in sort of understanding what that hierarchy is looking like is that you have all of these other organizations around the world that will insert into them. So understanding that, you have the creation of the Royal Society, which is the creation of modern science, as they describe it. And so the Royal Society is created by the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons. And they call themselves the last of the sorcerers and wizards and the first of the scientists with that transition. If you understand their language and understand their structure, you understand what they're doing and what they're saying. So, yeah, I think people who are at the lower levels of Freemasons think that it is an absolutely terrific society. And the good that they do and how they benefit is all good. But once they swear their allegiance to Satan as an adept, everything changes, and now they're told the true secret.
Okay. That just seems a little contradictory with the founding of the like the Templars, which preceded the Freemasons. Because in Scott's Akhenaten to the Founding Fathers book, he spoke a little bit about the Tau Piot tomb, and it just seemed like the Templars had like some kind of knowledge about Jesus that most of us don't know. It's just interesting. You're saying. Yeah.
The Templars were said to hold the secret, right? And the secret is the secret to the genealogies of certain bloodlines. So with the founding of the Templars, you have four very important people, and I won't go through all the names, I'll give the most important ones. You have the Anjou, who produced the Plantagenet. You have the St. Clairs, who produced the St. Clairs that go back to Rollo, that go back to the Tuatha De Danann, the Arianu that we talked about earlier on in the show from Norway, and they changed their names to St. Clair with the treaty after defeating the French. You have de Payon and you have de Bouillon. Now, Anjou, de Payon, and de Bouillon all come from the area of Rennes in France. And all of these Templars, except for two, which are Benedictine monks, and who will also have royal bloodlines, these are all sons of kings. These are ones that are going to take over thrones after a while. So this idea that the Templars were just poor monks, maybe some of them were with the two, but typically they're all going to have bloodlines and be second, third, and fourth sons if they're going to become mixed into the religious organizational structures, Christian or otherwise. And so these were all sons of kings. And Anjou, de Payon, and de Bouillon take their bloodlines back to Dagobert, who is the last survivor of the Merovingians, who takes their genealogies back to Nephilim, and also to at an intersection with King Amenemhat, who marries a female by the name of Urgan from the Welsh dynasties, the King Arthur dynasties, and interjects that bloodline in. And that bloodline, they say, is carrying the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, because Joseph of Arimathea, in their accounts, will take, in the Da Vinci Code, talks about this. I know it's a fictional book, but they're basing it on their beliefs. Takes Josephus, who is the third son, because Jesus is said to have been rescued off of the cross before he died, and then goes back to health, and later he meets up with Mary Magdalene, and they have 3 children. Other accounts have more, but 3 is the standard. And Josephus is the one who marries into the Pendragons of the Celtic kingships that produces the King Arthur kingship. That's the bloodline that crosses over. So before de Bouillon goes over Jerusalem in 1090, he meets with the Calabrians, which are part of the mystery school, the Pythagorean mystery school, that has ancient knowledge and building knowledge, and again, another rabbit hole we can't go down right now. And he is given instructions from their knowledge to excavate at Jerusalem, which has been taken by the Crusaders. And what the Templars are doing, they're excavating, and they're excavating for predetermined knowledge. And where the knowledge comes from is they take their bloodlines back to, and I'm talking about de Bouillon and de Van and Anjou and the Merovingians and everybody else who's meshed into the scion or grafting in of bloodlines, back to this intermarriage of the princes of Jerusalem that escape out of Jerusalem at the time of Jerusalem's destruction in 70 AD and escape to Europe. And they settle mostly in southwest France and parts of Spain, where you have like the Cathars and the Albigensians and all of this sort of rebellious nucleus that is going to cause the Albigensian Inquisition that takes place in medieval times. And so they take their lineage of the princes of Jerusalem back to the Essenes. And the Essenes were in control of the temple at the time of its destruction. And it's the Essenes who they believed that they had information on that hid all of these ancient genealogies and ancient knowledge that goes back to Heliopolis, back to Enoch before the flood, and is represented by the Pearls of Wisdom or the Archives of the Masons. This is the knowledge and gold and treasure that they are going to bring back to Europe. So that's the secrets that they're holding, and understand that the Templars are only monotheistic on the surface, but at the core and at the adept level, the ones who run at the master level and the grandmaster level, they are all adepts of polytheism and mysticism. And this organizational structure that they use comes back from the assassins who they were working with in the Middle East when they were formed into an order in 1099, and then formally with a bull status in 1128 and supported by Saint Bernard. They bring back the assassins, which is out of the Sufis, which is the mystical part of Islam. They bring back this organizational structure where they seem monotheistic at the surface, but they're polytheists underneath and actually Gnostics. So it's this Gnostic religion that they truly believe, and that's what the adepts actually worship, that is at the core of the Knights Templar, which is why Gnosticism is the religion of the secret societies, whether or not it's Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, the Illuminati, any of these groups. And Gnosticism is the religion that produces theosophy, which was designed to be the bridge to bridge science and religion in the end time, and then branches off into New Age with the advent of the alien phenomenon.
I don't know what to say about that. It's kind of brought us up to today, and what all these different philosophies I mean, probably just offended a whole bunch of our listeners too, but yeah, you do. No, it's true, but Gary does make a really good point of just drawing a line that links all these different philosophies together.
What I'm saying is they just have a different belief system than Christians do.
Yeah.
They have a different religion. That's all I'm saying.
Oh,
and they fully admit that.
Yeah, and it gets into like the alien stuff. That's almost a religion on of its own.
It is, yeah. And the question gets to be is, who are the aliens, right? So, are they actually beings from other planets? Are they demons, as some people think on the Christian side, or are they fallen angels, or are they actually beings that were created before the flood? Because we have this rich history of all of these amazing type of beings that are created before the flood. Everything from centaurs, which were sentient thinking beings and actually taught the heroes knowledge in the antediluvian epoch. And, you can go on and on of all these different types of beings. They also had the little people, which are the elementals, which were basically divided into three classifications. And one of them is the ugly ones, which has the gnomes in it, which has what you know as a gray gnome that has flying machines and technology that comes through portals that kidnaps people. And I have descriptions of this in my book that if people wanted to read it and they didn't know they were reading a fairy abduction, they would swear it was a great alien abduction because they're described exactly the same thing. So if you are a proponent, and the polytheists are, and the mystics are, that not only did the giants survive, but many of these other creations did, and there's a lot of theories as to how that would have happened, whether it's in the earth with the hollow earth theory, or cities under the earth, or off the earth in clouds, just as the centaurs were created in clouds and possibly spaceships, or that they survived somehow on other ark. So many of the accounts, whether it is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is talking about Pishtin and or Ziusudra, who is 2/3 god and 1/3 human, and his whole family was the same thing. This is the Nephilim survival story, just as Deucalion, which is thought to be the Greek Noah, and Pyrrha. Deucalion is the son of Prometheus, which makes him a Nephilim as well. So this is a Nephilim survival story. So there's all of these different accounts that suggest that perhaps them and Bigfoot and all of these other beings were helped by the gods or the fallen angels to survive the flood, right? And that's how they're showing up today. What we do know is from a Christian perspective, and what I think is that we are going to see these aliens as part of the end time deception. And so we better be, as a Christian perspective, well versed in Scripture so that we're not going to be deceived. But when it comes down to basically what most of the world believes, at least at the important ruling class level, there's two belief systems. There's a polytheism belief system and there's a monotheistic belief system. And I know there are atheists as well, but that is just another extension of polytheism. They just haven't looked behind the curtain yet.
Okay. All right, Gary, we're down. You did give us a great lead into tomorrow night's show with Marla Ventura, and she's going to be talking about gnomes and fairies and that kind of the little people stuff. So so thanks for that plug. But we have approaching 5 minutes, and I don't want the Blog Talk English Robo Babe to be another person mad at me since she is becoming AI. Can you tell us your website? Do you have some conferences, appearances, or anything like that coming up?
No conferences over the summer. Still trying to confirm a couple in the fall. The only one I've got confirmed is next March in Atlanta, but that's a long ways off, and that's with the Freedom Radio Group and Zen Garcia. So nothing on the schedule to be speaking in public at this point in time. But I continue to put out information on my Facebook site on a regular basis. As I mentioned earlier, I've started a three-part series on Ezekiel 32, and I've got a lot of interesting commentaries on giants and secret societies and stuff. So go there and go to one of the Genesis 6 conspiracy pages that will have all of those different blogs that I've done over the last 3 or 4 years.
Okay, and your website is Genesis6conspiracy.com?
www.genesis6conspiracy.com, and on that website you've got a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters, so you can get a good feel for my book. And there's a email contact there, so if you wanted some information on what I was talking about earlier in the show with the Genesis 1:1 to 1:2, renewal of the earth, the difference between days 4 and 6 in Eden, or if you wanted some interesting information on some of these secret societies, whether it's the Rosicrucians or it's the Templars or the Cross of Lorraine, I've got a nice 3-part series on that. Just tell me the subject area, I'll send you the document.
Okay, and you're with the 3 minutes left, I really do find your book, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, fascinating read. These aren't just your opinions. You have 100 pages of endnotes. You meticulously research these subjects, and it's all documented at the end of the book.
Yeah, I want to jump in if I can, Mark. Let me interrupt. I've read the book twice, and it's the kind of book that you are constantly going to be finding new things to think about, to ponder over, and to challenge your belief system. And that's a good thing. And the notes and the accuracy and the meticulousness with which he has written this book, and how he has strung stuff together so you actually understand what's going on, is just phenomenal. It's the kind of book you can read over and over again and always get something wonderful out of. And I loved it too.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I wanted to be transparent in my sources, so that's why I put so many endnotes. And I get a lot of comments, from people saying that is a huge bibliography there, and they've added a lot of books on their own, because it's all about getting information out there. So it's not about anything else other than here's what my research says, and you can go verify things for yourself if you like.
Yes. Okay. So. Hey, Barbara, how about we're getting pretty close to the end. Should we just wrap now?
I think it's you've got less than a minute, so I would say good night. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, you have a show tomorrow night, right?
I do with Marla Ventura. Yes.
Okay, and we'll see everyone Monday and Tuesday of next week as well. Thank you.